The New Orleans Saints have had a successful offseason here in 2023, but the fact of the matter is that none of it matters if they can't get what they need from their offensive line. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss the latest episodes. And if you want to continue the conversation with me one-on-one, you can do so by heading over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media. You can find me as the senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the New Orleans Saints. You can also find me every Tuesday on the Locked On NFL podcast and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're focused in on the offensive line because it seems like a pretty big piece to the New Orleans Saints' potential success in 2023. So we're going to break down some of the advanced analytics that tell the story of last year, where they need to improve going into this year. We'll take a look at health and depth being the most important elements to this New Orleans Saints O-line. But first, we want to just lay this all out. The New Orleans Saints have done a ton of great things, especially over on the offensive side of the football this offseason, but none of it matters if they don't get what they need from their offensive line. And that starts and ends with Derek Carr, the New Orleans Saints quarterback that they signed over the course of the offseason as well, and who they signed to big money, brought him in on a big old contract, all those other things, not surprising. And of course, that contract has a lot of mechanisms in it and all those other things in terms of true money versus money on the contract, all that. We know how the New Orleans Saints do, but the biggest priority for the New Orleans Saints has to be making sure that that quarterback has the impact that they want him to have on the offensive side of the football. And they're never going to be able to do that if they continue to struggle over on the offensive line. And those struggles can be and come in a bunch of different ways. Those struggles can come in the struggles in the run game. You can come in the struggles of the passing game, which actually the Saints were better as pass blockers on the offensive line last year than you might expect. We'll take a look at that in the advanced analytics section. But I also want to mention that it can come down to injuries and health, right? It doesn't have to be all the player's fault. It can be simply that they're unavailable because of an injury, because someone's toe gets stepped on, because somebody dislocates a toe, because somebody breaks an arm. It can be something entirely out of anyone's control that ends up impacting what this New Orleans Saints offensive line ends up looking like in 2023. That's why depth becomes so important. But when we look at where the New Orleans Saints offense is, it is an offense that's going to need its offensive line. Why is that? Every offense needs its offensive line, Ross. You're saying nonsense. But truly, the New Orleans Saints are going to need performance out of their offensive line if they want this brand of football that they seem to be ready to play in 2023 to go well. And we can start with the run game. You have to be able to block for the run game. You got to be able to open up the holes. You got to be able to attack. You got to be able to win at the point of attack. You have to dominate the line of scrimmage, all of those things. Especially now when you have a power back like Jamaal Williams, who's set to be the Saints' lead back, quote unquote, in terms of, heft of carry share and run share and all of those other things. Not necessarily that he's the feature back. Alvin Kamara, of course, is your superstar for however many games you're going to have him in 2023. But Jamaal Williams is going to see, we expect, the lion's share of snaps in terms of runs between the tackle. He's going to be that guy in short yardage situations and more, which is the thing that he wants to prove, is that he can be more than short yardage. That doesn't mean that he can't be short yardage at all. He absolutely will be. So you're going to need your run game for that. Look at what the New Orleans Saints have done when they have invested, or as they've invested in their skill positions. Re-signing Juwan Johnson, tight end. Bringing in Moreau, another pass-catching tight end, somebody that has a lot of familiarity with Derek Carr, that Derek Carr has a lot of familiarity with. Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, the second-year wide receivers, the rookie sensations from last year. These are guys that can stretch the field. Michael Thomas can stretch the field. He can take those longer developing routes over the middle of the field as well. The over routes, the posts, things like that. And with all of that, what do you need? You need time. you're going to need to create time and make sure that you're blocking for Derek Carr so that there's enough ticks on the clock for those players to be able to allow their route concepts to develop, the combinations to develop, the scheme to settle in. This was a big thing that the Saints struggled with last year. While the pass blocking was better than many expect that it was, it still wasn't the type of pass blocking that gives you a full opportunity to see what your offense can do. And especially now that you have a quarterback like Derek Carr who can get the ball downfield, but who also reads through the full field, can move back and forward, that can do a lot of different things and be mobile within the pocket to evade and kind of alleviate some of that pass rush. You want to make sure you're giving him time for everything to fully develop on the field. Now, the thing that's great about Derek Carr that maybe separates him from Jameis Winston and Andy Dalton is his anticipation, is the way that he builds familiarity and chemistry with those wide receivers so that the wide receiver doesn't necessarily need to be open at the time that he throws the ball. You look at some of the things that he did against quarters coverage last year, which includes 4 deep defenders on the defensive side of the ball. It could be 2 safeties and 2 corners, just depends upon the personnel that's available there. But you'll see several times where he's throwing passes toward the sideline downfield, even though the runner or the receiver is actually inside the hash marks, not even beyond the corner that's guarding him yet. But he knows what happens. Quarter coverage, you sit down. If you trust the speed of the receiver over on the outside, he can track the ball and get to it. If the defensive back is playing man coverage or is in zone coverage, but has his back turned to the quarterback, he can locate the ball where he wants the receiver to go, unbeknownst to the cornerback that's in coverage, all of those things. But you need time in order for those things to develop. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to give up a pressure here and there. Of course, that's going to happen. But where do you give up that pressure? That becomes a big thing. And where the Saints have struggled most in recent years is exactly where you don't want to be giving up pressure if you're an offensive lineman. You don't want to give up pressure up the middle. Why is that? Because keeping the middle of the pocket protected, where you might get some pressure off the edges and things like that, allows the quarterback to just simply be able to step up to evade pressure. So as long as you're not giving up pressure up the middle, Andrus Peat, Eric McCoy, Cesar Ruiz, the projected starters in the interior, at least going into training camp, if those guys aren't giving up immediate pressure up the middle, it's going to allow Derek Carr the opportunity to be able to buy some of that time by simply stepping up in the pocket, which also allows him to step into his throws and all the things that you want to allow an NFL quarterback to do as a part of his passing game. So that's 2 big reasons why you really need to see improvement from this New Orleans Saints offensive line, is so that the offense can click both in the run game, but also allow its concepts to develop, whether deep downfield or even in the intermediate to short areas of the field, just giving time for those concepts to be able to develop in order for him to be able to find the open receiver or throw the receiver open. But you can't do that if you're giving up pressure immediately up the middle or if your offensive line is falling apart as a whole. That's why health and depth also come into play here, because it's not just about the starting 5. Let's take a look at the entire offensive line group for the New Orleans Saints, where their best depth and key depth is, and how they can be looking to maybe stay a little bit healthier in 2023. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the number 1 sportsbook in all of America, and of course, your official sports betting partner of the NFL, and your official sportsbook partner here on the Locked On Podcast Network, the one and only place that I trust to tell you to go out there if you want to get in on some of the action. The MLB season is in full swing. If you want to get in on that action, FanDuel.com/lockedon is the place to go, because right now, new customers are going to be able to get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. That's $1,000 in bonus bets that comes right back at you, meaning that there's no losing with your first ever bet over at FanDuel. It's new customers only. FanDuel.com/lockedon to be able to take advantage of that no-sweat first bet too. And of course, you've got the NFL that you can bet on, the MLB, or excuse me, not the MLB. You've got MLB odds that you can bet on. So if you want to check everything out, head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon today. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. You get that no sweat first bet of up to $1,000. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks again, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Tomorrow is Wednesday. That means midweek fundamentals. So we're going to be breaking down a little something for you to make sure you're, kind of learning the game of football a little bit more as well. I like making it fun to be a fan. So we're going to continue the offensive line focus, take a look at offensive line gaps, blocking, double teams, things like that. So we're going to take a look at a bunch of that different stuff in tomorrow's episode, but of course also get you caught up on everything going on with the New Orleans Saints. Talk about some of the biggest stories around the team as well. So make sure you come through for another exciting episode of Locked on Saints tomorrow. For today, we're taking a look at this offensive line, breaking everything down. And I want to take this moment now to just kind of look at like what's most important for the New Orleans Saints in 2023 if they want that offensive line to be successful, if they want the offensive line to be successful. And one of the things two of the most important elements to the New Orleans Saints' success on the offensive line are going to be 1, health, and 2, depth. If the Saints don't have that, then this offensive line becomes the difference between the New Orleans Saints having a very exciting year to being another middle-of-the-road team. It's that simple. If you can't win in the trenches, it's going to be very hard to win football games. And it's going to be a lot of like massive individual performances that are going to lead you to wins that aren't going to be sustainable types of wins. Think back to 3 touchdowns by Alvin Kamara against the Raiders, 3 touchdowns by Taysom Hill against the Seattle Seahawks. That was not a sustainable style of winning games. So you needed these massive individual performances. You need team performances that win games. Like Alvin Kamara could score 3 touchdowns all he wants, but those are just, that's 18 points that goes to the team. And if you're not able to score 3 touchdowns every single week, that's a hard brand of football to try to repeat every single week. So the offensive line being able to protect in the passing game while also being able to protect in the run game allows you to have access to your entire offense. Just like we spoke about in the opening segment, that offensive line becomes a difference between how the Saints are going to be able to run, especially between the middle with Jamaal Williams, but also how they're going to be able to pass downfield in terms of protecting Derek Carr to buy time for things to develop down the field. So who are the players that the New Orleans Saints are going to be relying on in order to make sure that that happens? Well, we already know sort of the starting lineup, but let's take a look at what the Saints lineup looks like as of right now. There's some guessing in here in terms of depth and stuff like that. And some of the guys we would probably move around to multiple positions and everything. So not everything is as cut and dry as I'm laying out here, but let's take a look at it. So your starting 5 are pretty easy. Going from left tackle to right tackle, you're looking at Trevor Penning, the second-year left tackle who started 1 game last year, although he did appear in 6 different games, beginning week 12 throughout week 18, but got his final start, or his first NFL start, his final game. Now, unfortunately, he ended that season and that game with a foot injury that he is still rehabbing from, but the expectation is that a month from now that he'll be back out there as training camp is underway. Yeah, we're just less than a month away. Left guard, Andrus Peat. This is a guy that just redid his contract. The Saints aren't necessarily married to him at left guard here. We'll discuss that more in a little bit, though. But he's a projected starter for now. Your projected starter at center is Erik McCoy. No contest. Projected starter at right guard is Cesar Ruiz. Yes, the Saints didn't pick up his 5th-year option, but that doesn't mean that they don't like him. It's just that they don't want to guarantee an offensive lineman a boatload of money before they know if his one good year, which he had a solid late year last year before his injury, was repeatable or not. So they have to figure that out here in 2023. And then, of course, your star and your best player on your offensive line, Ryan Ramczyk, though Erik McCoy is coming for that, is at least competing for that title quite a bit. And Ryan Ramczyk, of course, is your starting right tackle. Okay, so let's stick with just those 5 for right now, right? Trevor Penning, Andrus Peat, Erik McCoy, Cesar Ruiz, Ryan Ramczyk. If you can keep those 5 players out on the field and healthy for 17 games, that would be the best case scenario for the New Orleans Saints. But the reality is that's probably not going to happen. That doesn't happen in the NFL. You take so many of these sort of like micro hits to the head, and then fingers get jammed, toes get stepped on, knees crash against one another, all that like inevitably something's going to happen. The Saints are going to have to default to somebody that's within their depth. But when it comes to that starting 5, it's actually a pretty solid lineup for the New Orleans Saints. There's a lot of athleticism there. Trevor Penning is athletic. Andrus Peat, the athleticism was the thing that sold the Saints on him outside of course, mass and what, from what Sean Payton had mentioned. Erik McCoy, you've seen him running 60 yards downfield, blocking for Alvin Kamara. You saw him last year all the way downfield, blocking for Taysom Hill, all that. Cesar Ruiz, remarkably athletic. And then Ryan Ramczyk is probably your best run blocker if you're the New Orleans Saints. And he's also a solid pass blocker as well, and has neutralized some of the best pass rushing talent in the NFL over the course of his years since joining the New Orleans Saints team as a part of that illustrious 2017 draft class when he came in along with Marshawn Lattimore and Alvin Kamara and Marcus Williams and Trey Hendrickson and others, and Al-Quadin Muhammad. And so I think, you look at where the Saints are in terms of their starting five, and they're actually in pretty good shape there. The question is, can they maintain their health and keep those five guys out on the field? Because that might be the difference between them being a solid offensive line group and a run-of-the-mill offensive line group. You look at Pro Football Focus, who's doing sort of their position group rankings right now. They're wildly low on everything across the New Orleans Saints board, and offensive line is no different. They have the New Orleans Saints projected starting lineup at offensive line, as we just laid it out: Trevor Penning, Andrews Pete, Eric McCoy, Cesar Ruiz, Ryan Ramczyk, going left to right, as the 24th ranked offensive line in the NFL. Now that's up 5 from where they ended the season last year, because they were actually 29th on this list at the end of last season. But the big things that they highlight are Trevor Penning, who got his first start at left tackle in his final game of his rookie year. So let's look at what that was. His final game in 2023, when he did get the start at left tackle, he played 58 total offensive snaps. 32 of them were run blocking snaps, 26 were pass blocking snaps. Throughout those 26 pass blocking snaps, he let up only one pressure, and it was simply a hurry. It wasn't a hit, it wasn't a sack, it was just the one pressure. Then he took a bunch of snaps as well over at as a run blocker and everything as well in that game. And in that game, the Saints had a total of 137 rushing yards, including over 100 by Alvin Kamara. So they ran 3 times at behind left tackle for 14 yards, but they ran 6 times around the left tackle for 47 yards, 7.8 yards per carry over on that side. They also ran twice in between the left tackle and the left guard for 14 yards. So it's a 7-yard average. And then that behind the left tackle, 3 for 14, was a 4.7 yard per attempt average. So pretty solid averages for the New Orleans Saints running around, at least in relationship with Trevor Penning. So that's good news there. But in terms of like what that starting five can do, we already know. But how far can they be successful down the depth chart? So let's go back to the lineup here. If we look at sort of the immediate backups behind multiple positions, James Hurst I have listed at left tackle, but he can play right tackle. He can play left guard. He can play right guard. So he's got four position versatility for you that you can utilize all over the place. And he's starter quality in terms of being a couple of those different positions, particularly on the interior. So that's good news for New Orleans. They've also added guys like Lewis Kidd, Billy Price, Calvin Throckmorton, Landon Young, who all have versatility to them. Landon Young, oftentimes listed as a right tackle, has been took left tackle snaps out at minicamp and out during OTAs. Calvin Throckmorton can play pretty much any position on the offensive line. When he was coming out of Oregon, he was a tackle, but he's played every single position, including center. Billy Price, who they just added, is a quintessential center, but can play quintessential center. Sorry, not a quintessential center. Quintessential center. Let me watch out for my inflection there, or my alliteration rather. But he can play anywhere on the interior. Lewis Kidd can play anywhere on the interior, and you can probably ask him to play tackle as well. Then they brought in a bunch of other like new names. Scott Lashley, who came in from Mississippi State. Coda Martin, who came in from Syracuse. Mark Evans, the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff guy who can play tackle. He can play guard. You can kind of put him wherever you want him as well. The big thing to watch out for is where is Nick Saldiveri going to be? So the Saints drafted Nick Saldiveri in the 2023 NFL draft at the very top of the third day. They traded up to the very first pick of the third day and selected him to make sure that they got the guy that they wanted. So it tells you everything that you need to know about how they feel about him. Could he be somebody that challenges Andrews Pete for that starting left guard role? Could it be somebody that even challenges Cesar Ruiz for the starting right guard role beyond this year, right? So the thing that separated the Saints in 2017, 18, 19 is that when they would get injured on the offensive line, these offensive linemen in terms of depth would step in and be fantastic. The Saints' depth got gutted in 2020 with the drop in salary cap and all those other things. They've spent now 2020, 2021, 2022, now going into 2023, trying to rebuild that. And I think this is the best that the offensive line depth has looked so far, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're done. I would be very surprised if they're fully done tinkering with that position group just yet. I think building up that depth so that if those injuries do happen, you're in a good place is a very, very wise decision by the New Orleans Saints. You're not always going to get starter quality guys at your 6, 7, 8 spots, but you try to get as close as you can. Now, we know that we can look back at previous things. It doesn't always tell us what we need to know about what's going on in the next season by looking back at previous seasons, but it does give us an idea of where you want to see the Saints improve. And the advanced analytics tell that story very, very clearly. So let's break that down as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints, using some advanced analytics to help tell the story about who the New Orleans Saints offensive line wasn't in 2022 and who they need to be in 2023. But I want to tell you a little bit about who they were in 2022 as well, because they were a sneakily good pass blocking offensive line in 2022, something I don't give them enough credit for, and something I don't see enough credit really being doled out in their way for. So let's take a look at this. Amongst all quarterbacks in the NFL that took at least 100 dropbacks in 2022, there's a really interesting story to be told here. Now, if you look at where Andy Dalton ranks amongst dropback percentage under pressure, so the percentage of time when Andy Dalton dropped back at quarterback and was under pressure, he was actually the 6th safest quarterback in the NFL by that margin. At 28.4% of his dropbacks were notched as under pressure, according to Pro Football Focus. And on top of that, you just want to know how far away it was. Tom Brady was number 1 in the NFL on what we thought was going to be a suspect Tampa Bay offensive line, by the way. But 20%. So he was only 8.4% worse than where Tom Brady was. Now, of course, if you flip that and you take a look at the percentage of time that he was kept clean, of course, that would also mean that he was the 6th most protected, 6th safest quarterback in the NFL as well, spending just 71.6% of his snaps, his dropbacks, under pressure when he was, completely clean from pressure. My apologies. So he spent 71.6% of his dropbacks completely kept clean, according to Pro Football Focus. Completed 72.8% of his passes when kept clean, but still threw 7 interceptions. Now, we know that a couple of those were probably ones that bounced off a receiver's hands, things like that, but also threw 13 touchdowns. So just to kind of look at the opposite of that, right? Like, where's Derek Carr on this list? So let's start with being in danger. How often was Derek Carr under pressure? Well, Derek Carr was under pressure amongst all quarterbacks with at least 100 dropbacks in 2022, the 8th most out of the NFL, 8th most in the NFL at 36%. Remember, the Saints number was 28.4% for Andy Dalton, 36%. And these are percentages. So this isn't about him playing more snaps and things like that. We're talking about an average per snap basis. And we know that the Saints were down to their 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th offensive linemen several times, won a game in Cleveland, down 4 offensive linemen for part of that game, down 3 starting offensive linemen for part of that game, all of that. Like, remarkable in terms of like looking back at these numbers and seeing. So, of course, conversely, when we look at how often Derek Carr was under pressure, of course he was, or conversely looking at how often he was kept clean, he was 6th lowest on that list at 64.1% of the time, or rather 64% of the time. My apologies. The thing that is so crazy about this, though, is that when he was kept clean, he actually threw 10 out of his 14 interceptions for the Raiders last year, 18 touchdowns, though. So when we look at where Derek Carr is in terms of his ability to be able to perform when he's kept clean, you can see it. Completed 67.3% of his passes, over 2,600 yards, 18 touchdowns, unfortunately 10 interceptions, which is really kind of shocking in terms of like, you don't usually see that. But I guess on average, you're throwing the ball more when kept clean than when you're under pressure. And so in those cases, I guess it makes sense when a raw stat as opposed to a percentage stat is up there like that, but not great. So you definitely want to see those interception numbers come down, but I think you can expect that in this New Orleans Saints offense. The other thing to keep in mind too is that like he was under pressure a lot, 36% of the time. Like, that's not far off from the top guy, Justin Fields, 45.7% of the time. So less than 10% difference between how often Derek Carr was under pressure with the Raiders and how often Justin Fields, who spent the entire season running for his life against or behind the Chicago Bears offensive line, did. So just something to keep in mind there, that like the Saints actually did a pretty good job protecting their offensive line or protecting their quarterbacks despite all of those injuries. So that's good news for the New Orleans Saints, especially if they do have to jump down to some of those to some of those depth players and things like that throughout the season. The other thing that I want to look at here is rush DVOA. So this is an advanced metric that allows us to take a look at over the average NFL team or under the average NFL team, how successful were the New Orleans Saints on a per snap basis, taking into consideration things like down and distance, game situation, all of that, right? Like a 2-yard run on 1st and 10 can't be valued the same way that a 2-yard run on 3rd and 1 is valued. So that's the kind of thing that this statistic or advanced analytic takes into consideration. So when we look at the rush DVOA for the New Orleans Saints, they were minus 9.9% in terms of their success rate, below the NFL's average. That was 24th in the NFL. Not great. So let's look at some of the individual statistics to give us an understanding of that. And this was mimicked, by the way, in EPA, which looks at expected points per play that's run if you're a team. So rush EPA, they were 27th in the NFL, but rush success rate, they're actually 12th in the NFL. So not terrible there. But looking at Alvin Kamara solely in this equation, Alvin Kamara faced 8+ man boxes only 22.42% of the time. That's 17th most in the NFL. That's not a bad place to be. We've seen Alvin Kamara in the top section of that conversation many times, but yet his rushing yards over expected came in at -5, so 12th lowest in the NFL. Rushing yards over expected assigns what they believe an NFL running back will total over the course of a season, and rushing yards, and then where they actually end up, and then they'll subtract one from the other, and it gives you the idea of over expected or under expected. So Alvin Kamara came in under expected, and that comes in terms of those rankings: 12th most against 8-man boxes, 12th lowest amongst rushing yards over expected. That's amongst running backs that had at least 10 carries times the number of games that they played. So it just helps you kind of get an understanding of like the workload that a running back has to actually get before they're a part of these rankings. And then when you look just kind of at the raw stats for Alvin Kamara rushed 223 times last season, almost had 900 rushing yards. You're seeing a very big workload for Alvin Kamara over the course of the past 2 seasons not really turn into the efficiency that you would expect from the run game. So some of that has to do with the offensive line. Some of that has to do with Alvin Kamara being asked to do things that he's not usually asked to do, which is be the bell cow back. Before, he was given 240 last year, 223 this year. His most was 197. He had never eclipsed 200 rushes in a single season during his career. So this is where the Jamaal Williams factor has a big impact. And this is where the Saints' offensive line can have a huge impact for the New Orleans Saints as well. Because out of all of those things that we just read out, the thing to keep in mind here is that the Saints struggled in the run game. They need to be better in the run game in 2023. They're actually surprisingly good against the passing or as pass blockers in 2022, but need to maintain that going into 2023. We look at the same amount of, just like looking at the percentages and how often these quarterbacks are under pressure and everything like that. Like, it's actually pretty surprising how good the New Orleans Saints were there. Now they need to maintain that, and hopefully Derek Carr can cash in a little bit more often, especially in the red zone and especially in score and striking distance, if given that same level of protection that Andy Dalton was given in 2022. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of where the New Orleans Saints offensive line is, the 3 biggest key factors for them: health, depth on the offensive line, and then maintaining time, whether that's for running back or whether that's for the quarterback. Either way should be massive implications for the New Orleans Saints that offensive line will have. So huge for them to be successful in 2023, and huge for the rest of the offense in order for them to be successful in 2023 as well. All right, coming up in tomorrow's episode, it's midweek fundamentals. So we're going to take a deeper dive into the offensive line, gaps, blocking schemes, things like that. We'll start to kind of break down the basics there. But we're also going to take a look at what exactly the New Orleans Saints might still be missing at this point. Is there anything that they could still add on either side of the ball? I'll tell you what I've got my eye on. Beyond the things that we've already discussed, like defensive end and linebacker, there's another spot I think that the Saints can add a specific type of talent that would help them quite a bit in 2023. Got that coming up for you in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Saints. Appreciate you as always making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day. And I thank you very, very much for making me a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.